Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing Lakota Nation versus United States to the table. This is a documentary film about the Lakota's constant resistance to the United States' never-ending settler colonialism.
Never-ending, exactly.
Never-ending. There are 3 parts in the film. The first is called Extermination, Part 2 is Assimilation, and Part 3 is Reparation. And the film starts by talking about the history of the Lakota people and their connection to the Black Hills mountain range, known to the Lakota as Hisapa. They talk about the treaties that the United States signed with the Lakota and then immediately violated, which became grounds for future lawsuits that are mentioned in the film. Then they get into the history of the United States westward expansion and manifest destiny, so-called, particularly in the wake of the collapse of Reconstruction, which ended when the Union pulled their armies out of the South to send them to the West, changing where they were fighting.
Right.
So they talk about residential schools and the history of trying to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, which was all about forced assimilation into the culture of the United States. They talk about resistance all along the way, including the court cases in the late 1800s up until the 1970s, when the Lakota won a case for $100 million, but refused payment because what they want is stewardship of the land.
That's right.
Also, $100 million was a ridiculously small amount of money, given the value of the land in the context of how the United States views land value.
Right. And interest in all the things. Yeah. Inflation. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So aside from the inherent concerns with taking money for land, it was like, no, that's not even the right value.
Absolutely.
For what you've taken. So the film includes resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline too, which runs through Lakota land as well. There's so much history of the United States violence and settler colonialism, and there are so many stories about Lakota resistance throughout the film. Yes. So with all of that, where do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a great intro. I mean, I think what's so brilliant about this film is all of that history. There's so much in it, so much jam-packed in this film that was new to me and that was really so illuminating and compelling to me. And I think the film was so well done, so well put together. And I'm really glad that you found it, that you brought it to the table for us, because I thought it was incredible. You know, for me, it really provided such a powerful look at their history and their lived experiences, and also just beautiful imagery of where they are from and their land and the Black Hills of South Dakota. I mean, it just was beautiful and so well done and lots to learn. So I would definitely encourage folks to watch this film. To me, I think one of the reasons why this film was so powerful was because it centered Indigenous people and the Lakota tribe and let them share their history and tell their own stories. And I think in this way, the film showcased their humanity, which, and in so many ways, the folks featured in this documentary made it clear to me that their humanity is something that they have wanted the United States to recognize since the beginning of time, right? And you talk about the violence that the United States has inflicted. I think the betrayal, the betrayal, the violence inflicted by the United States and the United States government over and over and over and over again, has meant that the history of these people has never been fully seen or honored or recognized in the ways that it should be, which is just, saying that it's a shame doesn't really fully do it justice. But it's a piece of this country's history that I think we need to continue to reckon with. And as we saw, throughout the film and as their movement work, their fight continues, it continues to be the case.
Yeah, and that's present in the way that folks resisted the Dakota Access Pipeline and other things too. There's this continued perspective from the United States that, and I forget who says this, but somebody says it in the film, I'm paraphrasing, that the U.S. relationship to land is something of extraction versus seeing the land as a living thing and there being a reciprocal relationship there. So, and that being at the heart of some of the differences between how the Lakota have viewed stewardship of the land versus how the United States views ownership
Of the land. Very good. Yes.
Yeah, it continues. And one of the great things about this film, aside from all the things we've mentioned up to this point, is how it connects back to a few things we've mentioned from homework over the last few episodes.
Yes.
So first, you wanted to learn more about the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yes.
Here we are learning a little bit more about it.
Absolutely.
And second, I mentioned an article co-written by Nick Estes. And here he is in the film.
That's right.
So, but anyways, I just thought that was a funny coincidence.
I know, look at that.
Nick talks about the way that the U.S. tries to frame its history. He says, quote, U.S. history is a branch of our history, but it's that covetous branch that thinks it's the tree, which I think is this perfect reframing on my thinking on history in the United States anyway, especially when the Lakota talk about the relationship to the land and the land being a living thing.
Yes.
Like history is actually in the land, and the U.S. history is a very brief piece of that history. The other thing that he says in this segment is about how the way the U.S. frames its history makes invasion look like self-defense.
Yes.
So he says, quote, the best way to kill people is to dehumanize them, to make them into caricatures, whether it's Peter Pan, whether it's John Ford's The Searchers, which is considered not just the archetype of Western movies, but one of the great American films. And this is a classic Hollywood trope that makes invasion look like self-defense. We weren't obsessed with the United States the way that the United States was obsessed with us.
Yes.
So if we reimagine our history from the perspective of Lakota people, we get a different set of questions and a different set of answers. And I think that just says a whole lot
Yes.
about how the stories we tell ourselves in the U.S. are warped. We have stories about self-defense against Indigenous people, which were actually not self-defense when you change the starting point of the story or you change the lens in which you're looking at it.
Absolutely.
And we have to continue to tell the truth about what happened. Otherwise, we continue to think in ways that cast ourselves as heroes when that's not the case in so many ways.
Absolutely. Well, good connection to all of the things we've talked about before on the show and in homework. But I also think one of the things that makes me think about too is, we've watched and consumed other media about how the media portrays folks. We talked about class and we talked about Black folks in this country. I mean, the ways in which the media and movies and popular culture have portrayed folks is a critical way that, or it has been a critical way that folks learn about a particular population, for better or for worse. And so I appreciate that this film spent some time talking about how Indigenous folks have been portrayed in the media. And that quote that he says, I wrote it down too. The best way to kill people is to dehumanize them. And that has absolutely been the case for Indigenous people as well. So yeah, I loved that. I want to come back to Nick, but there's someone else I want to talk about first because there are lots of incredible folks featured and interviewed in this documentary. One of the things that stood out to me the most was this idea of the fuel behind not just why the humanity of Native Americans and the Lakota tribe that I mentioned earlier, but also the why behind their beliefs and their fight.
Yeah.
I think that really resonated with me. And to me, that fuel is similar to other marginalized people and folks fighting for social justice and our collective liberation. So the person I want to talk about is Crystal Two Bulls. She is a Northern Cheyenne and Oglala Lakota organizer featured in the film. And I appreciated her wisdom so much. Like she's featured a bunch of times. Yeah, I want to learn more from her. She's done incredible organizing work against the Dakota Access Pipeline that you mentioned and for environmental justice and Indigenous people's rights. And so at one point in the film, she says, quote, I think resistance is always defined as being militant, or it's always looked at as something that's very aggressive. But for me, resistance, I'm just trying to exist in this world as who I am, as an Indigenous person, as someone who comes from this land and who came out of this land. For me, the sanctity and the sacredness of the Black Hills isn't just that it's a sacred site, but I think it's the fact that the land itself is life-giving. That's what makes it sacred. That's what the Black Hills represents to me. And honestly, that's what all land represents to me, is life.
Yeah.
I that quote is amazing. And I appreciated her sharing that for so many reasons. And her words, I watched this film a couple nights ago, her words continue to stick with me. And I think there's a lot you can unpack in that statement, but her thoughts on resistance particularly stood out to me because I think this idea of just trying to exist in the world as who you are is so profound. And it's at the center of what, our fight for collective liberation, our fight for justice is all about. And it's the fuel behind her humanity and her work. And I think it's also something that we can all connect to, as we think about what's fueling the work and the fight that we're all engaged in, and we talk about week in and week out. And so, that quote, I had to bring it to the table.
Yeah, that's so good, and it reminds me a little bit about Audre Lorde.
Yeah,
who said something sort of similar about in our world, her self-care was an act of resistance.
Yes.
And I'm paraphrasing because I don't quite remember it, but it's something to that effect, and it's really about existence as resistance.
Yes.
Which, when everything is organized in the way it is, to deny your humanity and deny your way of life, yes, your existence and your way of life is resistance to that denial. So I want to talk about the Dawes Act because it's something I hadn't learned much about, or if I had, it didn't stick.
Okay.
Whenever it was that I might have learned it.
Yep.
But I don't recall it at all. So, and it's an echo of history from land enclosure processes in England, which took place over the course of centuries to enforce concepts of private land ownership on common people at their expense for the benefit of royalty and aristocracy. And so this was a repetition of history.
Yes.
And Mary Catherine Nagel talks about this, and she called it a land grab, even though that's not what the U.S. called it. And she goes on to say, quote, by giving each Indian his own 160 acres, that individual ownership, that will civilize those heathens. So she's paraphrasing the thought process of the U.S. government in this act. And Craig Howe goes on to say, quote, they survey the land, they have a census, then they allot the land. The surplus land, quote unquote surplus, then was open to settlement, and settlement by almost always non-Indians. So this was a process, this was something designed to assimilate indigenous people into American capitalism, which was just one piece of the process of kill the Indian, save the man. And to take the land that wasn't allotted.
Right.
Because they just decided they were allowed to.
Yes.
And so you limit how much gets allotted, and then look at all the rest of this. I, by this law that is mine.
We've created. We've made up.
Yeah, we made up these rules, and you didn't agree to them, but we made them up and they're real. So good luck. So this was just one piece of the process of forced assimilation. And there's a lot in the film about residential schools and the ways that people today are still feeling the impact of that trauma. And residential schools have been a big topic in the news, particularly in Canada, because people have been finding the remains of people who died, children who died at those residential schools.
Wow.
And so it's been a big piece of news, more in Canada than here, but we had the same system.
Yes.
And so I'm intrigued to see how much history will continue to show up from those residential schools as we move forward here. But they talk about the impact of the trauma. And there's this moment when Alex Romero Frederick is talking about asking her grandpa to teach her Lakota because she wanted to know the language. And he told her no, it's not good for her and that she'll never make it in this world if he taught her. Mm-hmm. And he was a quote unquote product of residential schools. Right. So you can already see the trauma there, that he believes that he can't pass that along because it wouldn't do her any good.
Right.
And then one of the statistics mentioned in the film is that 80% of indigenous children were taken from families and sent to boarding schools. 80%, which is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And this happened because Richard Henry Pratt, a U.S. military veteran, I forget whatever rank he had, he created something called the Carlisle School, which the other residential schools were modeled after. And he appeared before Congress, and he told Congress that this would be a more effective way to take the land than continuing to fight on the battlefield, which was the purpose of taking children from
Yes.
the tribes. And so these are slightly veiled attempts to remove indigenous people from their land. And in some ways, like not veiled at all, taking children from the land is not a veiled attempt.
At all.
It is, as Mary Catherine Nagel said, it's kidnapping.
Yeah, man.
On a grand scale.
Absolutely.
And so all of this stuff is just, it was all part of the assimilation part, and just is mind-boggling when you put it all together that this was acceptable, and to see the ways that this echoes into today too is just, it's hard to fathom how much it's influencing what's happening now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think maybe I remember a little bit more about the Dawes Act than you do, but what I had no idea, what I learned for the first time about was these residential schools. And that portion of the film, I got emotional because you're right. It's kidnapping of children. It's assimilation. It is ripping away who these people are and what's important to them. And you're right, that quote about, her grandfather not wanting to teach her Lakota, not wanting to teach her the language, I should say. I think there's an intention there and a decision there to try to protect his granddaughter, but at what expense? That part really broke my heart in so many ways. And so I think you're right. I think we're going to see how that plays out. That will continue to play out. And so that will be interesting for us to track and see what happens.
Yeah. And not to mention the ways that we're repeating these policy choices on the border when we remove children from their parents. So, that's something that is continuing today.
Yes.
Even though the man sitting in the White House said that this was inhumane and went on to sign additional executive orders last week about shutting down the border and all kinds of. So, these are things that have happened and we have them in history, and they're continuing to happen today in slightly different forms.
Right, or to slightly different people, but we see it over and over again. That's why we talk about history here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. You brought up Nick Estes earlier. I want to talk about him again. He's a Lakota historian and scholar. And like Crystal Two Bulls, he offered so much brilliance and analysis throughout the film. So I appreciate everything that he brought to the film. I wanted to talk about something that he said toward the end of the film and what's at the center of settler colonialism, which you brought up at the beginning here, and the impact of settler colonialism and the impact that's had on indigenous people in this country. So he says, quote, "The organizing principle of any settler society is elimination of the native. They don't hate us because of our language, because of our culture, because of our spirituality. The intent of treaties, the intent of removal, the intent of boarding schools has always been the elimination of native people to gain access to the land. It may seem reductive, but when you look at the arc of U.S. history, that is fundamentally the intent of the United States, is to gain access to native land." And I think that statement in and of itself is spot on. It's absolutely what's at the center of settler colonialism. It speaks to the devastating and dangerous nature of settler colonialism. And that's also at the center of our country's history. But one of the things I audibly said out loud to myself when I was watching this film the other night, specifically when he said, "They don't hate us because of our language, culture, and spirituality," was, well, I think it's that too, right? I think hate and an unwillingness to engage with the humanity of indigenous people in this context is a part of settler colonialism and in what this country has done to indigenous people. And so I'm not at all disagreeing with what Nick said there. I just kind of personally think, given what we saw time and time again throughout history with indigenous people, but with lots of different populations in this country, I do think hate, unfortunately, has been present, has played a role in what's happening there, especially when in this film we see, again, the violence that is inflicted upon the Lakota and the indigenous people. And, this... there was never, I felt like there was never an attempt to get to know these folks and who they were and what was important to them and really truly engage them in, how can we coexist? It was, let's write these treaties and then immediately break them. Like from the jump, there was never an attempt. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the violence to the people, but also the violence to the land.
Yes.
At one point we see the mountains of buffalo that were killed on purpose to take from people. And I think there's something to be said about the way that hate has played a role throughout history in settler colonialism and white supremacy and other forms of oppression. And I think it's hate in a dehumanizing way, or like a way to see to see people as less than.
Yes, or
and
other.
So
Yep.
it's a form of hate that maybe doesn't feel active at the time. And I like that's
a good point. Yep.
So I don't know. I think there's something there that I haven't fully thought through, but
Yes.
what you said makes me think about, how does hate play a role in these systems? There is a role, and I wonder if the role is like the way that the system teaches the so-called oppressor to hate other people, to hate the oppressed,
right?
So to speak. And I wonder if that's where hate plays a role, as you see it in the individual play out.
Right.
It's not. Yeah. So I appreciate it's an interesting exploration of how we parse out what hate is and what hate means in these systems.
Yeah, well, this is exactly why I wanted to bring this here and have this conversation, because I think about a friend and former colleague of mine that had this notion of a first draft thought. Yeah. And so in the moment, that is literally what I said out loud. I was like, well, I'm not so sure. Wait a minute, Nick. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to bring that here. And I think you're right. There's probably more nuance there, and we should think about the individual versus the collective level. Yes, absolutely. I love that.
So I think there's something to it, and it's also
more complicated.
Yeah, it's very, very complicated.
Wow.
So let's talk about application. Feels like a good time to shift and talk about application. How does this apply to our day-to-day lives? So my application is from Mary Catherine Nagel, again, who said, quote, "When we think of the past as just being in the past, we actually do harm today. Because until we address what happened in the past, understand it, and seek to create remedies and redress it, we're doomed to repeat it." And I think this is the story of so many things about our country. We want to say that things are different, that we've evolved, we've changed somehow. But ultimately, we haven't begun to understand on a grand scale how much harm this country has caused and what the harm is still doing today.
Yes.
We haven't taken the time at all to understand the generational trauma of so many people in this country. And so many people want to ignore that and talk about how it's in the past, so we don't need to worry about it. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. But then they ignore how the past is reverberating in our present.
Yes.
And we can't actually address things, as she says, that are happening now without addressing the history that's living in all of us, to paraphrase James Baldwin.
Yes.
So, all of that.
All of that.
What's your application for this
great
week?
Stuff. Yeah, I think there's no shortage of application from a documentary like this, because it's real life, and there are folks trying to live in their humanity, as we've talked about. So for me, the application of this film is the resounding imperative that exists for all of us to take the time to learn about and sit with this history that you talked about and the lived experiences of Indigenous people in this country, and to, again, figure out why that is and why that's important, and to incorporate that into our movement and our organizing work. So I'm sort of piggybacking off of your application there. The other thing I was thinking about is I want to quote Crystal Tubles again here, specifically what she says toward the end of the film. So she says, quote, "None of us achieve liberation without each other. We can work towards Indigenous land back and Black reparations. This is not an either-or situation, and we do not live in a world of scarcity. To be honest, I don't want to achieve my liberation and my sovereignty unless I bring my relatives with me."
Yes.
And that's it, right? Yeah. That's the statement. That's what we mean when we talk about collective liberation. My liberation is connected to your liberation. And I don't want to, as she says, achieve my liberation and my sovereignty unless I bring my relatives, my people, everyone with me.
Yeah.
And so that to me was just a powerful piece of application from this film for me. And I wanted to bring it here.
Yeah, I love that. I thought it was so spot on and touches exactly on solidarity that we've been talking about.
Yes.
It's all of the things, and reminds me that we might be working in a specific piece of movement work.
Yes.
But we're all connected
Absolutely.
in that work somehow. So love that. Thank you for bringing that.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about homework. What do we want to do to continue learning about this beyond our conversation today? There are so many people in this film to continue to learn from.
Yes.
We've mentioned a few folks here already, but I'd love to read more and hear more from a lot of the people in this documentary, like Nick Tilson, who helps run the NDN Collective, Henry Red Cloud, who is doing a lot of sustainable energy work, Phyllis Young, who did a lot of work in the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about the Dakota 38. They were mentioned in the film I shouldn't say very briefly. They were mentioned in the film briefly. as 38 Lakota warriors who were hanged in the wake of the Sioux Uprising. That's the largest mass execution in U.S. history. It happened the same week that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's a lot in that.
Yes.
But yeah, what about you? What's your homework?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we both talked about this in application. You just brought it up. I think there's so much more to consume and to learn about and learn from in terms of Indigenous history. So I want us to figure out how we do that and maybe how we can do that via this podcast of ours.
Yeah.
So I'm co-signing that homework. The other thing I want to do for homework is to check out the information and the resources that are available on the website blackhillsjustice.org. So this website was flashed on the screen at the very end of the film.
Sure was.
And so I wanted to mention it here and amplify it so others can also check it out, blackhillsjustice.org. And I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from that website too and all of the resources that are on it as well. So yes, history and this website are my homework.
Great stuff. Well, thank you for joining me today on this conversation about the Lakota versus the United States.
It's exactly what I get paid to do.
Wait. Yeah. You're getting paid?
Oh no, the secret's out.
Yikes.
We're going to have a tough conversation when this is over, folks.
Oh no. All right. Well, that is it for this week. Damien, you're up next week. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah. So for our next episode, I'm bringing our June book to the table for us to talk about. Woot woot. It's a new one, too. It was just published by our friends over at Haymarket Books back in April, which is really exciting for them and for the authors. So the book is called How to Abolish Prisons, Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment. And it was written by Rachel Herzing and Justin Pichet, with a foreword written by the one and only Miriam Kaba.
Ooh.
Yeah. So here's what Haymarket has on their website about this book. Quote, drawing on extensive interviews with abolitionist crews all over North America, Herzing and Pichet provide a collective reconstruction of what the grassroots movement to abolish prisons actually is, what initiatives it has launched, how it organizes itself, and how its protagonists build the day-to-day practice of politics. Readers sit in on the Winnipeg ride shares of Bar None and the meetings of the Chicago Community Bail Fund as they assess the utility of politicized mutual aid. They follow the campaigns and coalitions of critical resistance in Oakland and San Francisco and Survived and Punished in New York City, and learn about the prisoner correspondence projects that keep activists behind bars and outside them in constant coordination. Abolitionist campaigns are constructing on-the-ground initiatives across North America to deconstruct carceral society and build resistance communities. Through the words, deeds, and personalities of this beautifully peopled movement, How to Abolish Prisons emerges as a stunning snapshot of a movement's thinking in motion.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great... who wrote that? Can you write my bio? That sounds like a brilliant book. I'm so excited to get to talk about this great book with you next time, my friend.
Me too. I'm really excited to read it. I am behind and have not opened it yet.
I also haven't opened yet. Oh, wow. That hardly ever happens. You usually start before I do.
Yeah. I've been, I don't know.
Think life. Life is life.
Life is lifing.
Yeah.
So, well, we'll have to get to that because there's a few hundred pages we need to read before we talk about this next week.
Yeah,
so
but I know we're both very excited to actually crack it open and start it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll get to it.
Yes.
No problem. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok, check us out on YouTube, sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.